The carriage stopped at the end of a dirt lane, and Maren Holloway looked out at what her husband had called the property, with the same expression she might have worn reading a legal notice she had not expected. It was not a castle. It was not a ruin, exactly. It was a farmhouse that had once been something more. Wide stone walls, a wraparound porch with 2 posts missing, a kitchen garden so thoroughly overtaken by brambles that the original beds were visible only as faint rectangular shadows beneath the green, the kind of place that looked like it had been waiting a long time for someone to decide whether it was worth saving. The driver set her trunk on the ground without a word and turned the horses back toward the road before she had crossed the gate. Maren stood in the lane for a moment. The June air smelled of clover and something older, soil that had been turned recently, or perhaps not at all. She picked up the trunk herself, because there was no one else, and carried it to the porch. Her husband, Edmund Calloway, had explained very little at the wedding breakfast that morning. He had said that the Connecticut house was not ready to receive her yet, that there were matters requiring his presence in Boston, and that the farm in Hadley would suit her perfectly well through the summer. He had said all of this with the careful politeness of a man informing a stranger of train times. Then he had shaken her father's hand, nodded to her once, and stepped into a separate carriage. She had watched it disappear down the hill and felt not what she had expected to feel. Not grief, not rage, something quieter and more precise. The recognition that she was now entirely on her own, and that this was, in certain ways, a condition she already knew how to inhabit. A woman appeared in the doorway before Maren reached the top step. She was somewhere past 60, gray-haired, with the posture of someone who had made peace with hard work a long time ago. Her name was Ruth Alcott, and she served as housekeeper, groundskeeper, and, as far as Maren could tell in the first 5 minutes, the only person who had set foot on the property with any regularity in the past 2 years. "Mrs. Calloway," Ruth said. Not warmly. Not coldly. Simply the way someone says the name of a season they didn't choose. "Miss Holloway is fine," Maren said. Then, because that was not technically accurate anymore, "Maren is fine." Ruth looked at the trunk. "I'll have Samuel bring that up." "Who is Samuel?" "My nephew. He comes Tuesdays and Thursdays for the heavy work." Ruth held the door open. "There's a room made up on the 2nd floor. The water heats well. The stove is temperamental in the mornings, but reliable by afternoon." Maren stepped inside. The house was clean. That was the first thing she registered. It was clean in the way a place is, when one very capable person has been responsible for too much of it for too long. The surfaces were neat, but the curtains were faded to the color of old paper. The wallpaper in the entry hall had begun to lift at the corners. The rug at the foot of the stairs had a worn path down the center so deep it seemed almost geological. Things were managed. Nothing had been maintained. "How long has Mr. Calloway owned this property?" Maren asked. "It was his father's," Ruth said from the kitchen. "Edmund grew up here until he was 12. His father left it to him when he passed, 7 years ago." "And Mr. Calloway, does he visit often?" A pause. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. "He came twice after his father died. Not since." Maren looked around the entry hall. A hunting print hung slightly crooked above the side table. A man's coat, very old, still hung on the hook by the door. "I see," she said. She did not ask what she actually wanted to ask, which was why, then, he had sent her here. Whether this place was a convenience to him, a storage solution, or something he had genuinely believed would be acceptable, she suspected she would not like any of the possible answers. And she had learned, growing up as the eldest daughter in a household that ran on careful silence, that some questions were better observed than voiced. She went upstairs and unpacked her trunk. Her father had arranged the marriage in February, and she had agreed to it in the way she agreed to most of his arrangements. Quietly, and with the private understanding that she would make of it what she could. Her father was not a cruel man. He was a businessman who applied business logic to every problem, including the problem of 3 daughters and a firm that had, in the 2 years since her mother's death, quietly begun to bleed money in places he had not yet found. Edmund Calloway was 34, heir to the Calloway Textile Holdings, and, as her father had described him, reliable. What her father had not mentioned, and what she had learned through her own inquiries before the wedding, was that the textile holdings were not in the condition his reputation suggested. She had asked her father's bookkeeper about it 3 weeks before the ceremony. Mr. Graves had looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man caught between two loyalties and said, carefully, that Mr. Tentelney, Calloway's assets were complex. Maren had thanked him and gone to her father's library and read every document related to the Calloway accounts that she could locate. It had taken 4 evenings. What she found was not fraud. It was neglect. The particular financial disorder of a man who had inherited a great deal and trusted other people to manage it without ever learning to read what they gave him. She had noted this and said nothing. It was not her business yet. Then it was. The farm in Hadley was 400 acres, mostly let to tenant farmers who worked the outer fields. The house itself sat on 12 acres that were, in theory, private grounds. Kitchen, garden, orchard, pasture, and a small pond that have silted in from years without dredging. There was also, Ruth informed her, a cottage at the north edge of the property where a couple named the Aldriches had lived rent-free for 11 years, in exchange for fence maintenance and light pasture work. "Do they maintain the fences?" Maren asked. Ruth's expression did not change. "The south fence went down in March. It has not been repaired." "And the arrangement? Who authorized it?" "Mr. Fenwick from the management office in Springfield. He handles the property accounts." "Which office?" "Fenwick & Sons. They've held the management contract since Mr. Calloway Sr." Maren wrote the name down in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. She had started keeping it her 3rd day on the property. By the end of the first week, it had 17 entries. The kitchen garden was the first project she took on because it was the most legible. She could see exactly what it had been. The original beds were there beneath the neglect, waiting. She borrowed gloves from Ruth and started at the south corner on a Tuesday morning, while Samuel Alcott watched her from a respectful distance before finally coming over and asking if she'd like help. He was 20, quiet, and had the useful quality of doing exactly what he was told without requiring an explanation of why. She told him they were going to reclaim 4 beds before the end of June. He nodded and picked up a spade. Ruth watched this from the kitchen window and made no comment, which Maren had come to understand was Ruth's version of approval. By July, the kitchen garden had 4 working beds and a 5th cleared and ready. The orchard she assessed and found salvageable. The trees had not been pruned in years, which meant the fruit would be poor this season, but the root systems were intact. She asked Samuel about the pond. He said there was a neighboring farmer, Mr. Hale, who had dredging equipment and had offered twice to do it in exchange for grazing rights on the east pasture. "Was the offer accepted?" Maren asked. Mr. Fenwick said the grazing arrangement would need to be reviewed. She wrote that down too. In the middle of July, she wrote a letter to Fenwick & Sons requesting a full accounting of the management fees charged against the Hadley property in the past 5 years, and a copy of the original management contract. She signed it with her full name, Maren Calloway, and included Edmund's name as property owner. The reply came 11 days later. It was polite, brief, and contained neither the accounting nor the contract. It said that Mr. Fenwick was happy to arrange a meeting with Mr. Pater Calloway at his earliest convenience to review the property's financial history. She read it twice. Then she wrote back and said that Mr. Calloway had authorized her to act on his behalf in all matters related to the Hadley property, and that she would need the documents by the 1st of August. This was not entirely true. She had received 1 letter from Edmund in 2 months, a single paragraph confirming that the Boston situation had extended through summer, that he hoped she was comfortable, and that she should address any property concerns to Fenwick. He had not said she could act in his name, but he had not said she could not. The documents arrived on the 28th of July. She spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table with Ruth's lamp and her notebook, and worked through 5 years of quarterly statements with the same methodical attention she had once applied to her father's ledgers. What she found was not dramatic. It was the quiet, sustained dishonesty of a man who had understood very clearly that no one was looking. Fenwick and Sons had been billing the Calloway estate a property management fee of $140 per quarter for 5 years. This was, in itself, not unreasonable for an active management arrangement. What was unreasonable was that the contract, which she finally found folded inside the third quarterly statement from 1883, specified a fee of $60 per quarter, with increases tied to a cost of living index that, when she calculated it properly, would have brought the fee to approximately $72 by the current year. She set the contract beside the most recent statement and looked at them for a long time. The difference was $68 per quarter. Over 5 years, across 20 quarters, the Calloway estate had been overbilled approximately $1,360. She wrote the figure at the bottom of her notebook page and underlined it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular clarity that comes after a long period of suspicion. Not satisfaction, but resolution. The fog lifts. What is underneath it is simply what it is. She closed the notebook and went to bed. Edmund arrived on a Thursday evening in late August, unannounced, in a hired carriage from Springfield. Maren was in the orchard when she heard the wheels on the lane. She came around the side of the house with soil on her gloves and a basket of the season's first usable apples. Not enough to be proud of, but a start, and found him standing on the porch looking at the new gutter Samuel had hung along the east side. He was taller than she remembered. She had been in the same room with him exactly 4 times before the wedding, always at social gatherings where the conversation had been general and the silences had been populated by other people's noise. He had dark eyes, and he held himself with a carefulness that she had initially read as reserve, and had since come to understand was something else. A man who had learned to take up less space than he occupied, who moved through his own life as though he were a guest in it. He looked at her across the yard for a moment. "You've done something to the east wall," he said. "The gutter was pulling away from the fascia," Maren said. "It would have taken the corner drainage with it before winter." He looked at the gutter again. "When did you notice that?" "June." He did not say anything to that. He looked at the basket of apples. "May I?" he said. She held the basket toward him. He took one, turned it in his hand, and looked up at the orchard as though he was doing the arithmetic of how many years it had been since he'd seen it produce fruit. "I didn't expect the trees to be in this condition," he said. "They weren't," Maren said. "Samuel and I pruned them in late June. It was too late in the season for a full yield, but the root systems are sound. Next year should be different." He looked at her with an expression she did not yet have a name for. Not surprise, exactly. Something that lived beside surprise, and had not quite decided whether to move closer. "I see you've been busy," he said. It was the kind of thing people say when they have not quite caught up to the reality in front of them. She did not hold it against him. "I'll have Ruth set a place for dinner," she said. She showed him the notebook after dinner. She had considered waiting, had considered a dozen different approaches, and had concluded that there was no version of this that was not awkward. And the least damaging awkward version was the direct one. She set it on the table beside his coffee and opened it to the page with the underlined figure. "I found this in the quarterly statements," she said. "The management contract specifies a base fee of $60 per quarter. Fenwick and Sons have been billing $140 for 5 years." He looked at the page. She watched him trace the columns with his eyes. The contractual amount, the billed amount, the year-by-year totals, the cumulative difference. "You requested the statements yourself?" he said. "I wrote to them in July. You'd mentioned addressing property concerns through their office." "I meant ordinary concerns." He looked up. "Repairs. Tenant matters." "I wasn't sure where ordinary ended," Maren said. "I thought it was better to find out." He was quiet for a long moment. She had learned in the past weeks not to fill his silences prematurely. $1,360, he said. "Approximately. I can show you the calculation if you want to verify it." "I don't doubt the calculation." He closed the notebook and set it on the table with a deliberateness that told her he was thinking about something beyond the money. My father used Fenwick when I was a boy. I continued the arrangement because I assumed." "I know," Maren said. He looked at her. "You knew before you found this." "I suspected there might be something. The dredging arrangement they'd blocked. The south fence that went down in March and wasn't repaired. Small things that didn't quite fit." He was quiet again. Outside, the evening had settled fully into dark, and the lamp on the table made the kitchen feel closer and warmer than the rest of the house. "What would you advise?" he said. It seemed to cost him something to say it, not the asking itself, but the particular shape of it. The acknowledgement that she had seen something he had missed. "Write to Fenwick and request a reconciliation," Maren said. "Present the contract and the billing discrepancy, and ask for an accounting. If they return the overbilled amount voluntarily, end the contract professionally and retain someone local. If they don't, you have the documentation to take it further." He looked at her for a moment with the same unnameable expression from the yard. "And the property management itself," he said, "going forward." "I have some thoughts on that," Maren said, "if you'd like to hear them." He said that he would. He stayed 4 days. They walked the property on the second morning, all 12 acres of the house grounds, and then out along the east pasture lane to the fence line where Samuel had begun the repairs. He asked questions about the tenant arrangements and listened to her answers without interrupting. She showed him the pond and explained what Mr. Hale had offered, and what it would take to make the east pasture grazing agreement work fairly for both sides. He looked at the silted pond for a long time. "My father used to fish here," he said. "Not to her exactly. To the place itself." She said nothing. Some things don't need a response. On the third day, a letter came from Fenwick, addressed to Edmund. He opened it at breakfast and passed it to her without a word. It was an explanation, justification, really, of the fee increase, attributed to expanded scope of services that were nowhere in the original contract. She read it, set it down. "They know you have the contract now." "Yes," he said. "That response means they're not planning to return the funds voluntarily." I had the same reading. He picked up his coffee. "Will you draft the letter to the attorney? I'll review it and sign." She drafted it that afternoon, at the kitchen table, with Ruth moving around the kitchen and not saying anything, which continued to be Ruth's highest form of acknowledgement. When she gave Edmund the draft that evening, he read it twice, made 2 small changes to the language, and signed it. "You write plainly," he said. "I think plain is usually better," Maren said. He looked at the letter in his hand. "My father would have agreed with you." He folded it and set it on the table. He was not a man who complicated things unnecessarily. I think I made the mistake of assuming that meant everything was simpler than it was. It was the most he had said about himself in 4 days. She recognized it as something offered carefully, the way people offer things they are not sure will be received. She received it carefully in turn. "He left you good land," she said. "The foundation is sound." He looked up at her. He looked at her long enough that she was aware of it, not uncomfortably, but in the way you are aware of a shift in weather. Something clarifying. "I should have come back sooner," he said. She didn't answer that. The truth of it was plain enough that adding to it felt unnecessary. She picked up the letter and set it with the outgoing mail by the door, and when she turned back to the table, he was still looking at her, and this time she did not look away. He returned to Boston on the 4th day, but something had changed in the texture of the leaving. He shook Ruth's hand and thanked Samuel by name for the fence work. He stood on the porch for a moment before the carriage came and looked out at the orchard as though he was calculating something privately, adding up a sum that had nothing to do with money. "I'll be back in 6 weeks," he said. "The pond dredging should be done by then," Maren said. "Mr. Hale and I worked out the grazing terms." He turned to look at her. "You moved forward with it." "You said to address property concerns through the estate," she said. "I thought this qualified." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the structure that lives beneath a smile before a person decides whether to let it through. "It did," he said. "Yes." The carriage came up the lane, and he picked up his bag. At the gate he paused and turned back. At the gate he paused and turned back. "Maren," he said. She was still on the porch. He had never used her name before, not once in all the months they had been married. She had noticed the absence of it the way you notice a missing step in a staircase. Each time you expect it, and it isn't there. "The apple was good," he said, "from the orchard." It was a small thing to say. It was not a small thing. "Next year will be better," she said. He held her gaze for one moment longer than necessary. Then he got into the carriage, and she watched it go down the lane, through the iron gate, and out along the road toward Springfield. She stood on the porch until the sound of wheels faded. Then she went back inside, picked up her notebook, and added to the list of things that needed doing before October: winterize the south bed, patch the plaster in the east upstairs room, write to the county assessor about the pond boundary line, order glass for the cold frames before the price went up. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected the farmhouse, or Hadley, or a husband who looked at an apple as though it contained an apology. She had not expected to find, in the work of keeping a neglected place alive, something that felt, in its quietest moments, like the beginning of a life she had not imagined, but could almost, now, begin to see the shape of. She set the notebook on the table, put the kettle on, and stood at the kitchen window while the morning light came over the orchard. The trees stood in their long rows, already bare at the edges, but still and sound at the root. Patient, waiting for the season to turn.